Hi, everybody. This is a piece by someone named Melinda Cooper, and it's titled, Why I Am Not a Post-Secularist. Now, this is not something I know too much about, so there will probably be a lot of moments of me looking things up, and hopefully that helps you as much as it helps me. Here we go. It is in moments of crisis that capital reinvents its attachments to tradition, coming down from its speculative highs to preach the austere truths of fundamental value. In England, the turn to austerity has taken on a decidedly theological flavor. The welfare reforms recently enacted by the coalition government of Liberal Democrats and Conservatives draw inspiration from the work of David Cameron's philosopher king and founder of the Red Tory movement, Philip Blond, who also happens to be a former student of the Anglo-Catholic theologian John Milbank. According to Wikipedia, Philip Blond was born in 1966. Philip Blond is an English political philosopher, Anglican theologian, and director of the Respublica think tank. I'm going to look up the Respublica think tank. Respublica is a British independent public policy think tank founded in 2009 by Philip Blond. It describes itself as multidisciplinary non-party political research organization whose aim is the creation of bold solutions for enduring socioeconomic problems. Respublica's ideas are founded on the principles of post-liberal vision of the future, which moves beyond the traditional political dichotomies of left and right, prioritizing the common good. Wikipedia says John Milbank was born in 1952. John Milbank is an English Anglo-Catholic theologian and is an emeritus professor in the Department of Theology and Religious Studies at the University of Nottingham, where he is president of the Center of Theology and Philosophy. John Milbank previously taught at the University of Virginia and before that at the University of Cambridge and the University of Lancaster. John Milbank is also chairman of the trustees of the think tank Respublica. Milbank founded the Radical Orthodoxy movement. John Milbank's work crosses disciplinary boundaries, integrating subjects such as systematic theology, social theory, ethics, aesthetics, philosophy, political theory, and political theology. He first gained recognition after publishing Theology and Social Theory in 1990, which laid the theoretical foundations for the movement which later became known as Radical Orthodoxy. In recent years, John Milbank has collaborated on 3 books with philosophers Slavoj Žižek and Creston Davis entitled Theology and the Political, The New Debate, published in 2005, The Monstrosity of Christ, Paradox or Dialectic, 2009, and Paul's New Moment, Continental Philosophy and the Future of Christian Theology. Milbank delivered the Stanton Lectures at Cambridge in 2011. Milbank's friendship and substantial intellectual common ground with David Bentley Hart has been noted several times by both thinkers. Okay, back to the text. The welfare reforms recently enacted by the coalition government of Liberal Democrats and Conservatives draw inspiration from the work of David Cameron's philosopher king and founder of the Red Tory movement, Philip Blond, who also happens to be a former student of the Anglo-Catholic theologian John Milbank. Footnote: these welfare reforms were passed on February 29, 2012. In June 2012, David Cameron announced his intention to press ahead with a new round of reforms, if elected, without the support of the Liberal Democrats. End footnote. Previously housed at the Labour Party's Demos Institute, but now fronted by its own think tank, Res Publica, the Red Tory movement aspires to bridge the gap between right and left by combining the right's social conservatism with the left's concern for social welfare. According to Wikipedia, Demos is a cross-party think tank based in the United Kingdom with a cross-party political viewpoint. Founded in 1993, Demos works with a number of partners including government departments, public sector agencies, and charities. Demos specializes in public policy making in a range of areas from education and skills to health and housing. Demos houses the Center for the Analysis of Social Media, which leads the study of how the rise of the digital world affects politics, policy, and decision-making. The current chief executive is Polly Curtis, a former journalist and editor at The Guardian, HuffPost UK, Tortoise Media, and PA Media. The organization is an independently registered educational charity. According to Wikipedia, a Red Tory is an adherent of a center-right or paternalistic conservative political philosophy derived from the Tory tradition. It is most predominant in Canada, however. It is also found in the United Kingdom, where it is more commonly known as one-nation conservatism. This philosophy tends to favor communitarian social policies while maintaining a degree of fiscal discipline and a respect of social and political order. It is contrasted with, quote, blue Tory or, quote, high Tory. Some Red Tories view themselves as small c conservatives. In Canada, Red Toryism is found in provincial and federal conservative political parties. The history of Red Toryism marks differences in the development of the political cultures of Canada and the United States. Canadian conservatism, American conservatism have been different from each other in fundamental ways, including their stances on social issues and the role of government in society. Red Tory governments in Canada, such as those of John A. Macdonald, Robert Borden, John Diefenbaker, were known for supporting an active role for the government in the economy. This included the creation of government-owned and operated crown corporations such as the Canadian National Railway, and the development and protection of Canadian industries with programs such as the National Policy. The adjective red refers to the economically left-leaning nature of Red Toryism in comparison with blue Toryism, since socialists and other leftist parties have traditionally used the color red. In Canada today, however, red is commonly associated with the Liberal Party. The term reflects the broad ideological range traditionally found within conservatism in Canada. Okay, so back to the text. Much of the movement's success stems from its claim to oppose the antisocial proclivities of Margaret Thatcher's neoliberalism, even as it espouses the hard truths of neoliberal labor reform. The Red Tory critique of neoliberalism is essentially a moral one. Economic liberalization has broken the bonds of, quote, custom, tradition, family, end quote, leading to a wholesale demoralization of working-class life in particular. Footnote. See Philip Blond, Red Tory, How Left and Right Have Broken Britain and How We Can Fix It. published in 2010. End footnote. The theologization of welfare promises to restore such values without otherwise questioning the class, gender, or race politics of neoliberal reform. In practice, this is translated as an intensification of work for welfare sanctions, obliging the poor to work in whatever job or whatever pay alongside the devolution of welfare services themselves to faith-based organizations. In a context of generalized austerity, welfare is becoming newly and emphatically conditional upon moral norms of faith, family, and tradition. There is much that is predictable here. The coalition's welfare reforms build on the foundation laid by the communitarian Tony Blair, himself a member of the Christian Socialist movement, and the impresario of the Tony Blair Faith Foundation. Wikipedia says, the Tony Blair Faith Foundation was an interfaith charitable foundation established in May 2008 by former British Prime Minister Tony Blair. Since December 2016, the Tony Blair Faith Foundation's work has been continued by the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change. Sorry, back to the text. There's much that is predictable here. The coalition's welfare reforms build on the foundations laid by the communitarian Tony Blair, himself a member of the Christian Socialist movement, and the impresario of the Tony Blair Faith Foundation, and follow in the wake of faith-based workfare policies introduced in Australia under John Howard and in the United States under Bill Clinton and George W. Bush, to name only the most proximate cases. Footnote. For a comparative analysis of the introduction of faith-based welfare/workfare in North America, England, and Australia, see my Workfare, Family Care, Godfare, Transforming Contingency into Necessity, published with South Atlantic Quarterly in fall 2012. End footnote. Such reforms are in keeping with a more diffuse trend toward the institutional revitalization of religion as an instrument of social policy. The instigators of labor austerity are far from averse to the lenifying and moralizing. What the hell does lenifying mean? Lenify means alleviate, assuage, mitigate, soften. The instigators of labor austerity are far from averse to lenifying and moralizing interventions of the charitable. Indeed, from a global perspective, some combination of labor informalization and faith-based welfare might be considered the defining impulse of neoliberal statecraft. Cameron's, quote, welfare revolution, then, is only the latest development in a now well-established tradition of neoliberal social reform. What sets the UK experiment apart is its philosophical pedigree in the work of John Milbank, founder of the Radical Orthodoxy School, and a key figure in what some have called the post-secular turn in social theory. One second. I'm sorry, Magdalena. The internet in this house is a cost. Okay. So, according to Wikipedia, post-secularism, I guess I should have looked this up in the beginning, refers to a range of theories regarding the persistence or resurgence of religious beliefs or practices in the present. The quote post may refer to after the end of secularism or after the beginning of secularism. Okay, where am I? According to Wikipedia on radical orthodoxy, radical orthodoxy is a Christian theological and philosophical school of thought that makes use of postmodern philosophy to reject the paradigm of modernity. The movement was founded by John Milbank and others and takes its name from the title of a collection of essays published by Routledge in 1999, Radical Orthodoxy, A New Theology, edited by Milbank, Catherine Pickstock, and Graham Ward. Although the principal founders of the movement are Anglicans, radical orthodoxy includes theologians from a number of ecclesial traditions. Footnote. The line of influence is made clear in Milbank and Blond's co-authored publications. See, for example, John Milbank and Philip Blond's No Equality and Opportunity by synthesizing old Tory and traditional left ideas, a genuinely egalitarian society can be achieved, published in The Guardian on the 27th of January 2010. Few have explored the tight connection between Red Toryism and radical orthodoxy. One important exception is Nathan Coombs, who has written the following illuminating pieces: The Red Tories' True Colors, published in The Guardian, November 4th, 2009, and The Political Theology of Red Toryism, published in February 2011. End footnote. Milbank and others in the radical orthodox movement espouse a purist theology that is close to the ultra-conservatism of Pope Benedict the 16th, yet claims to have absorbed the lessons of postmodern philosophy, to which it now aspires to write the absolutist sequel. According to the Wikipedia for Pope Benedict the 16th, Pope Benedict the 16th, born Joseph Louis Ratzinger, lived from 1927 to 2022. Pope Benedict the 16th was head of the Catholic Church and sovereign of the Vatican City-State from the 19th of April 2005 until his resignation on the 28th of February 2013. Benedict XVI's election as Pope occurred in the 2005 papal conclave that followed the death of Pope John Paul II. Pope Benedict XVI chose to be known as Pope Emeritus upon his resignation, and he retained this title until his death in 2022. Ordained as a priest in 1951 in Benedict XVI's native Bavaria, Ratzinger embarked on an academic career and established himself as a highly regarded theologian by the late 1950s. Pope Benedict XVI was appointed a full professor in 1958 at the age of 31. After a long career as a professor of theology at several German universities, Pope Benedict XVI was appointed Archbishop of Munich and Freising and created a cardinal by Pope Paul VI in 1977 an unusual promotion for someone with little pastoral experience. In 1981, Benedict XVI was appointed prefect of the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith, one of the most important dicasteries of the Roman Curia. From 2002 until he was elected Pope, Benedict XVI was also Dean of the College of Cardinals. Before becoming Pope, Benedict XVI had been a, quote, major figure in the Vatican, on the Vatican stage for a quarter of a century, end quote. He had had an influence, quote, second to none when it came to setting church priorities and directions, end quote, as one of John Paul II's closest confidants. Benedict's writings were prolific and generally defended traditional Catholic doctrine, values, and liturgy. Benedict XVI was originally a liberal theologian but adopted conservative views after 1968. During Benedict XVI's papacy, Benedict XVI advocated a return to fundamental Christian values to counter the increased secularization of many Western countries. Benedict XVI viewed relativism's denial of objective truth and the denial of moral truths in particular as the central problems of the 21st century. Benedict XVI also revived several traditions and permitted greater use of the Tridentine Mass. Benedict XVI strengthened the relationship between the Catholic Church and art, and promoted the use of Latin and reintroduced traditional papal vestments, for which reason he was called the, quote, Pope of Aesthetics, end quote. Benedict XVI's handling of sexual abuse cases within the Catholic Church and opposition to usage of condoms in areas of high HIV transmission was substantially criticized by public health officials, anti-AIDS activists, and victims' rights organizations. On the 11th of February 2013, Benedict XVI announced his effective 28th February 2013 resignation, citing a, quote, lack of strength of mind and body, end quote, due to his advanced age. Benedict XVI's resignation was the first by a pope since Gregory XII in 1415, and the first on a pope's initiative since Celestine V in 1294. Benedict XVI was succeeded by Francis on the 13th of March 2013 and moved into the newly renovated Mater Ecclesiae monastery in Vatican City for his retirement. In addition to his native German language, Benedict had some level of proficiency in French, Italian, English, and Spanish. He also knew Portuguese, Latin, Biblical Hebrew, and Biblical Greek. He was a member of several social science academies, such as the French Académie des Sciences Morales et Politiques. He played the piano and had a preference for Mozart and Bach. Okay, so that's Pope Benedict XVI. Harking back to the patristic roots of early modern theology, beyond what he perceives to be the rationalist compromises of late scholasticism, Milbank seeks to revive an Augustinian theology of participation that sees all, quote, science, end quote, emanating from the truth of divine illumination. According to Wikipedia, and I don't know if this is exactly what's being referenced here about late scholasticism, but there's an entry for second scholasticism. Second scholasticism is the period of revival of scholastic system of philosophy and theology in the 16th and 17th centuries. The scientific culture of second scholasticism surpasses its medieval source, scholasticism, in the number of its proponents, the breadth of its scope, the analytical complexity, sense of historical and literary criticism, and the volume of editorial production, most of which remains hitherto little explored. Augustinianism is the philosophical and theological system of Augustine of Hippo and its subsequent development by other thinkers, notably Boetius, Anselm of Canterbury, and Bonaventure. Among Augustine's most important works are the City of God, De Doctrina Christiana, and Confessions. Originally, Augustinianism developed in opposition to Pelagianism. It was widespread in medieval Western philosophy until the arrival of Thomism and Aristotelianism. Plato and Plotinus influenced Augustine in many ways, and he is considered a Neoplatonic philosopher. The Augustinian theodicy and the Augustinian doctrines such as the divine illumination and the invisible church show a strong Platonic influence. Pope Benedict XVI cautioned that all the Western church teachings lead to him. Quote, St. Augustine, this man of passion and faith, of the highest intelligence and tireless in his pastoral care, a great saint and doctor of the church, is often known, at least by hearsay, even by those who ignore Christianity, or who are not familiar with it, because he left a very deep mark on the cultural life of the West and on the whole world. Because of his special importance, St. Augustine's influence was widespread. It could be said, on the one hand, that all roads of Latin Christian literature led to Hippo, today Annaba, on the coast of Algeria, the place where he was bishop from 395 to his death in 430, and, on the other, from this city of Roman Africa, many other roads of later Christianity and of Western culture itself branched out. End quote. So, back to the text. Milbank seeks to revive an Augustinian theology of participation that sees all, quote, science, end quote, emanating from the truth of divine illumination. Milbank's vision of the proper sphere of influence due to the theological is nothing less than totalizing. Theology must be restored to its place as, quote, queen of the social sciences, end quote. Indeed, as inner truth and foundation of the social itself, via the wholesale remoralization promised by faith-based welfare. Footnote. John Milbank, Theology and Social Theory Beyond Secular Reason. End footnote. In response to the inquiry of a sympathizer, Milbank described himself as, quote, extremely, quote, conservative, end quote, against abortion, experiments on fetuses, against any idea that homosexuality can be the subject of equal rights, in favor of the importance of sexual difference, critical of liberal feminism, and holding the opinion that the separation of sex and procreation is in effect a state capitalist program of bioethical tyranny, etc., etc. Jesus Christ, end quote. Quoted by Craig Carter in, quote, John Milbank on Radical Orthodoxy's Evolution Toward Historic Orthodoxy, published in the book, on the blog, The Politics of the Cross Resurrected. End footnote. Not surprisingly, Milbank is elated at the prospects of British faith-based welfare reform and the role of his student, Philip Blond, in instigating it. Quote, believe me, this is something big, end quote, he enthused in a recent interview. Footnote, see Nathan Schneider, Orthodox Paradox, an interview with John Milbank. End footnote. Much like the 19th century Christian and utopian socialist from whom he claims inspiration, Milbank's anti-capitalism assumes an essentially restorative and corporatist form. Working on the principle that, quote, all true opposition to capitalism is necessarily conservative, end quote, Milbank opposes the exchange relation because the exchange relation liberates the workers from traditional hierarchies. First and foremost, that of the patriarchal household, not because it institutes an exploitative relationship of its own. Footnote: Milbank, Theology and Social Theory. Milbank is not so much concerned with undoing the power relations of contract as returning to a pre-contractual notion of fundamental value, embodied in the, quote, gift relation, end quote, of unpaid labor, particularly of the, quote, feminine, end quote, kind. Footnote: John Milbank, Socialism of the Gift, Socialism by Grace, published in New Black Friars 77 in 1996. To this end, Milbank proposes to, quote, remoralize, end quote, the economy by re-anchoring exchange value in a newly sacred understanding of, quote, land, quote, people, and, quote, money. Footnote: C. Schneider, Orthodox Paradox, the affinities between Milbank's moral economy and those of Karl Polanyi or an E.P. Thompson are not incidental. The history of socialism is replete with social conservatives who would love to reinstate the bucolically patriarchal charms of feudal life. End footnote. In volatile times, God is the ultimate safe haven. Milbank's unlovely ruminations have graced the pages of almost every major volume of the, quote, post-secular turn, including one edited by a blonde. John Milbank's political alliances do indeed stretch beyond the, quote, long outdated, end quote, difference between left and right. Footnote: John Milbank, The Future of Love, Essays in Political Theology, end footnote. Most conspicuously, Milbank functions as the Holy Spirit in the theoretical trinity filmed by the Maoist Badu, God the Father, and the Leninist Zizek, Baby Jesus, whose sexual politics are almost as orthodox as his. Motivating these alliances is a coolly strategic calculus that the, quote, sort of young person who might once have been Marxist, end quote, in the most orthodox sense, can now be directed towards the absolute truths of religion. He may well be right. Much of what passes for post-structuralist philosophy these days really does read like a co-production between the Vatican and the Socialist Workers' Party. Footnote: Creston Davis, John Milbank, and Slavoj Žižek, edited volume Theology and the Political, The New Debate. John Milbank, Slavoj Žižek, Creston Davis, and Catherine Pickstock, edited volume Paul's New Moment, Continental Philosophy and the Future of Christian Theology. Terry Eagleton, Reason, Faith, and Revolution, Reflections on the God Debate, published in 2009. Alain Baidu, St. Paul, The Foundation of Universalism, translated by Ray Brassier, published at Stanford University Press in 2003. Alberto Toscano is undecided whether a, quote, theology against the state, end quote, will prove useful to the Leninist cause, but in the meantime appears to be hedging his bets. See Alberto Toscano's Rethinking Marx and Religion, published in some French journal in 2009. End footnote. No doubt many of Milbank's more anti-parliamentary allies will be scrambling to dissociate themselves from his embarrassing proximity to the seats of state power. But before they do, and before the inevitable amnesia sets in, I would like to pause and recognize the political success of Red Toryism for what it is, the clearest expression of what a commitment to, quote, post-secular philosophy, end quote, means in practice. By opening this essay with a consideration of Christian faith-based welfare, I wish to avoid the theoretical exceptionalism that separates the question of political theology from the context of neoliberal social reform, and the cultural exceptionalism that equates the return of the religious with one particular faith, in most cases Islam. The resurgence of theology as an instrument of social regulation is evident in post-colonial, post-socialist, and post-Keynesian contexts alike, with relative indifference to the historical secularism or otherwise of the state. As such, it is anything but exceptional. In Eastern Europe, the transition to post-communism has reinvigorated the social authority of the Catholic and Orthodox churches, ushering in a virulently homophobic and natalist style of religious nationalism, replete with its own fantasies of cultural contamination from the West. In Israel, the archetype of the neoliberal ethno-religious state, the religious far right, of which the ultra-Orthodox Haredim represent only one current, exerts a growing influence on the gender politics of everyday life, even as the Israeli state presents itself as the beacon of secular democratic values in a region of encroaching fundamentalisms. In Egypt, Pakistan, Jordan, Algeria, Indonesia, and Malaysia, IMF-imposed economic reforms have gone hand in hand with efforts to re-immoralize social life via appeals to Islamic family law, the rise of faith-based welfare, and the obsessive policing of female sexuality in public space. During the Algerian Civil War, a massively significant episode in recent post-colonial history, the rise of political Islam assumed a blatantly neo-fascistic form. Without descending into civil war, Egypt has seen the rise of a similarly virulent far right, one that has been immortalized in the work of Samba Mahmoud. Wikipedia says Samba Mahmoud lived from 1961 to 2018, was a professor of anthropology at the University of California, Berkeley. At Berkeley, Samba Mahmoud was also affiliated with the Center for Middle Eastern Studies, Institute for South Asia Studies, and the Program in Critical Theory. Samba Mahmoud's scholarly work straddled debates in anthropology and political theory, with a focus on Muslim-majority societies in the Middle East and South Asia. Samba Mahmoud made major theoretical contributions to rethinking the relationship between ethics, politics, religion, and secularism, freedom and submission, and reason and embodiment. Influenced by the work of Talal Asad, she wrote on issues of gender, religious politics, secularism, and Muslim and non-Muslim relations in the Middle East. According to Wikipedia, Haredi Judaism is a branch of Orthodox Judaism that is characterized by a strict interpretation of religious sources and its accepted halakha, Jewish law, and traditions, in opposition to more accommodating or modern values and practices. Its members are usually referred to as ultra-Orthodox in English, a term considered pejorative to many of its adherents, who prefer the term strictly Orthodox or Haredi, plural Haredim. Haredim regard themselves as the most authentic custodians of Jewish religious law and tradition, which in their opinion is binding and unchangeable. They consider all other expressions of Judaism, including modern orthodoxy, as deviations from God's law, although other movements of Judaism would disagree. Some scholars have suggested that Haredi Judaism is a reaction to societal changes, including political emancipation. The Haskalah movement derived from the Enlightenment, acculturation, secularization, religious reform in all its forms from mild to extreme, and the rise of the Jewish national movement. In contrast to modern Orthodox, Haredim segregate themselves from other parts of society, although some Haredi communities encourage young people to get a professional degree or establish a business. Furthermore, some Orthodox groups like Chabad Lubavitch encourage outreach to less observant and unaffiliated Jews and Hilonim, secular Israeli Jews. Thus, professional and social relationships often do not form between Haredi and non-Haredi Jews due to the stark contrast of their beliefs. As of 2020, there are about 2.1 million Haredim globally, representing 14% of the world's Jewish population. Jesus. Haredim primarily live in Israel, 17% of Israeli Jews and 14% of the total population. North America, 12% of American Jews, and Western Europe, most notably Antwerp and Stamford Hill in London. Due to a virtual absence of interfaith marriage and a high birth rate, the Haredi population is growing rapidly. Their numbers have been further boosted since the 1970s by secular Jews adopting a Haredi lifestyle as part of the Baal Teshuvah movement. However, this has been somewhat offset by those leaving. Alright, so, where am I? Sub-Saharan Africa, back to the text. Sub-Saharan Africa, for its part, is seeing the rapid rise of the morally conservative Pentecostal and charismatic churches, whose newfound social role as para-welfare states has been directly abetted by U.S. aid funding of faith-based HIV/AIDS services. According to Wikipedia, charismatic Christianity is a form of Christianity that emphasizes the work of the Holy Spirit and spiritual gifts as an everyday part of a believer's life. It has a global presence in the Christian community. Practitioners are often called charismatic Christians or renewalists. Although there is considerable overlap, charismatic Christianity is often categorized into three separate groups: Pentecostalism, the charismatic movement, which is spread across historical Christian denominations, and the neo-charismatic movement. Charismatic Christianity grew out of Protestantism and is distinguished from Pentecostalism by making the act of speaking in tongues no longer necessary as evidence of baptism with the Holy Spirit, and giving prominence to a diversity of spiritual gifts. According to the Pew Research Center, Pentecostals and charismatic Christians number over 584 million worldwide as of 2011. Pentecostalism, or classical Pentecostalism, is a Protestant charismatic Christian movement that emphasizes direct personal experience of God through baptism with the Holy Spirit. The term Pentecostal is derived from Pentecost, an event that commemorates the descent of the Holy Spirit upon the apostles and other followers of Jesus Christ while they were in Jerusalem celebrating the Feast of Weeks as described in the Acts of Apostles. Like other forms of evangelical Protestantism, Pentecostalism adheres to the inerrancy of the Bible and the necessity of the new birth, an individual repenting of their sin and, quote, accepting Jesus Christ as their personal Lord and Savior, end quote. It is distinguished by belief in both the baptism in the Holy Spirit, end quote, and baptism by water that enables a Christian to, quote, live a spirit-filled and empowered life, end quote. This empowerment includes the use of spiritual gifts, such as speaking in tongues and divine healing. Because of their commitment to biblical authority, spiritual gifts, and the miraculous, Pentecostals see their movement as reflecting the same kind of spiritual power and teaching that were found in the apostolic age of the early church. For this reason, some Pentecostals also use the term, quote, apostolic, or, quote, full gospel, to describe their movement. Holiness Pentecostalism emerged in the early 20th century among radical adherents of the Wesleyan holiness movement, who were energized by Christian revivalism and expectation of the imminent second coming of Christ. Believing that they were living in the end times, they expected God to spiritually renew the Christian church and bring to pass the restoration of spiritual gifts and the evangelization of the world. In 1900, Christian Charles Parham, an American evangelist and faith healer, began teaching that speaking in tongues was the biblical evidence of spirit baptism. Along with William J. Seymour, a Wesleyan holiness preacher, he taught that this was the third work of grace. The 3-year-long Azusa Street Revival, founded and led by Seymour in Los Angeles, California, resulted in the growth of Pentecostalism throughout the United States and the rest of the world. Visitors carried the Pentecostal experience back to their home churches or felt called to the mission field. While virtually all Pentecostal denominations trace their origins to Azusa Street, the movement has had several divisions and controversies. Early disputes centered on challenges to the doctrine of entire sanctification, and later on the Holy Trinity. As a result, the Pentecostal movement is divided between holiness Pentecostals, who affirm 3 definite works of grace, and finished work Pentecostals, who are partitioned into Trinitarian and non-Trinitarian branches, the latter giving rise to oneness Pentecostalism. Comprising over 700 denominations and many independent churches, Pentecostalism is highly decentralized. No central authority exists, but many denominations are affiliated with the Pentecostal World Fellowship. Over 279 million classical Pentecostals worldwide, the movement is growing in many parts of the world, especially the global south and third world countries. Since the 1960s, Pentecostalism has increasingly gained acceptance from other Christian traditions, and Pentecostal beliefs concerning the baptism of the Holy Spirit and spiritual gifts have been embraced by non-Pentecostal Christians in Protestant and Catholic churches through their adherence to the charismatic movement. Together, worldwide Pentecostal and charismatic Christianity numbers over 644 million adherents. While the movement originally attracted mostly lower classes in the global south, there is a new appeal to middle classes. Middle-class congregations tend to have fewer members. Pentecostalism is believed to be the fastest-growing religious movement in the world. U.S. Aid is an independent agency of the United States government that is primarily responsible for administering civilian, foreign, and development assistance. With a budget of over $50 billion, USAID is one of the largest official aid agencies in the world and accounts for more than half of all U.S. foreign assistance, the highest form in the world in absolute dollar terms. Congress passed the Foreign Assistance Act on September 4, 1961, which recognized U.S. foreign assistance programs and mandated the creation of an agency to administer economic aid. U.S. aid was subsequently established by the executive order of President John F. Kennedy, who sought to unite several existing foreign assistance organizations and programs under one agency. USAID became the first U.S. foreign assistance organization whose primary focus was long-term socioeconomic development. USAID's programs are authorized by Congress in the Foreign Assistance Act, which Congress supplements through directions in annual funding appropriation acts and other legislation. As an official component of U.S. foreign policy, U.S. aid operates subject to the guidance of the President, Secretary of State, and the National Security Council. U.S. aid has missions in over 100 countries, primarily in Africa, Asia, Latin America, the Middle East, and Eastern Europe. Okay, back to the text. The historically unprecedented appearance of populist homophobia and a right-to-life politics in a sub-Saharan context is not incidentally connected to the growing traffic between African Pentecostalism and the U.S. evangelical right. In India, the Bharatiya Janata Party, BJP, has emerged as a serious political force espousing both the deregulation of the national economy and a murderous sexual vigilant ethos of Hindu supremacism. The Bharatiya Janata Party, or Indian People's Party, is a political party in India and one of the two major Indian political parties alongside the Indian National Congress. Since 2014, the BJP has been the ruling political party in India under the incumbent Prime Minister Narendra Modi. The BJP is aligned with right-wing politics and has close ideological and organizational links to the Rashtriya Sevik Sangh, a far-right paramilitary organization. Its policies adhere to Hindutva, a Hindu nationalist ideology. As of January 2024, it is the country's biggest political parties in terms of representation in the Parliament of India as well as state legislatures. The party's origins lie in Bharatiya Jana Sangh, which was founded in 1951 by Indian politician Syama Prasad Mukherjee, after he left Hindu Mahasabha to form a party of the political wing of RSS. After the emergency of 1975 to 1977, Jana Sangh merged with several other political parties to form the Janata Party. It defeated the then incumbent Indian National Congress in the 1977 general election. After 3 years in power, the Janata Party dissolved in 1980, with the members of the erstwhile Jana Sangh reconvening to form the modern-day BJP. Although initially unsuccessful, winning only 2 seats in the 1984 general election, it grew in strength on the back of the movement around Ram Janmabhoomi in Uttar Pradesh. Following victories in several state elections and better performances in national elections, the BJP became the largest political party in Parliament of 1996. However, it lacked a majority in the lower house of Parliament, and its government, under its then leader Atal Bihari Vajpayee, lasted for only 13 days. After the 1998 general election, the BJP-led coalition known as the National Democratic Alliance under Prime Minister Vajpayee formed a government that lasted for a year. Following fresh elections, the NDA government, again headed by Vajpayee, lasted for a full term in office. This is the first non-Congress government to do so. In the 2004 general election, the NDA suffered an unexpected defeat, and for the next 10 years the BJP was the principal opposition party. Narendra Modi, then Chief Minister of Gujarat, led the party to a landslide victory in the 2014 general election. Modi has since led the NDA government as Indian Prime Minister, including being re-elected with a sole majority in the 2019 general election and with a coalition in the 2024 general election. As of December 2023, the alliance governs 17 Indian states and union territories. The official ideology of BJP is integral humanism. First formulated by Deen Dayal Upadhyaya in 1965, the party advocates social conservatism and a foreign policy centered on nationalist principles. During its first period of national government, the BJP avoided its Hindu nationalist priorities and focused on a largely liberal economic policy that prioritized globalization and economic growth over social welfare. Since returning to government in 2014, the BJP government has enacted several priorities of the RSS, including criminalization of the practice of triple talaq and revoking Article 370 of the Constitution of India, which granted autonomy to Jammu and Kashmir, abrogating its statehood. India has experienced nationwide democratic backsliding under the BJP's rule since 2014. Back to the text. Actually, I wanted to look up something real quick. I wanted to look up what Hindutva is. Hindutva, literally Hinduness, is a political ideology encompassing the cultural justification of Hindu nationalism and the belief in establishing Hindu hegemony within India. The political ideology was formulated by Vinayak Damodar Savarkar in 1922. It is used by the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, RSS, the Vishva Hindu Parishad, the current ruling Bharatiya Janata Party, BJP, and other organizations collectively called the Sangh Parivar. Inspired by European fascism, the Hindutva movement has been described as a variant of right-wing extremism and as, quote, almost fascist in the classical sense, end quote, adhering to a concept of homogenized majority and cultural hegemony. A homogenized majority and cultural hegemony. Some have also described Hindutva as a separatist ideology. Some analysts dispute the identification of Hindutva with fascism and suggest Hindutva is an extreme form of conservatism or ethno-nationalism. Alright, so back to the text. In India, the Bharatiya Janata Party, BJP, has emerged as a serious political force espousing both the deregulation of the national economy and a murderous sexually militant of Hindu supremacism. The complex relationship between Hindu nationalism and European fascism, both intimate and innovative, has been amply documented. In these and other instances, the revitalization of religion has served as a response and counterpart to the process of neoliberal economic reform. That the guardians of moral law present themselves as the ultimate and final defense against the onslaught of global capital in no way detracts from their actual complicity with the neoliberal state. The return of religion is as effectively internal to the project of neoliberalism as it is rhetorically oppositional. For this reason, one must be wary of the claims to cultural exceptionalism that are a hallmark of a certain style of post-colonial and post-secular thinking. Such gestures not only serve to obscure the political fractures that traverse the post-colonial nation, refiguring resistance in the form of classless cultural opposition, but also neglect the considerable affinities between Western and non-Western forms of cultural nationalism. The ambivalences of this position are evident in Partha Chatterjee's classic study of cultural nationalism, which posits a methodological and historical difference between the, quote, external, end quote, orientation of colonial nationalism and the, quote, internal, end quote, life of everyday cultural tradition. According to Wikipedia, Partha Chatterjee, born 1947, is an Indian political scientist and anthropologist. Partha Chatterjee was the director of the Center for Studies in Social Sciences, Calcutta, from 1997 to 2007, and continues as an honorary professor of political science. He is also a professor of anthropology and South Asian studies at Columbia University and a member of the Subaltern Studies Collective. And the book being referred to is The Nation and Its Fragments by Partha Chatterjee. The overview of the book on Princeton.edu, which I guess is with Princeton University Press. In this book, the prominent theorist Partha Chatterjee looks at the creative and powerful results of the nationalist imagination in Asia and Africa that are posited not on identity but on difference with the nationalism propagated by the West. Arguing that scholars have been mistaken in equating political nationalism with nationalism as such, he shows how anti-colonialist nationalists produced their own domain of sovereignty within colonial society well before beginning their political battle with the imperial power. These nationalists divided their culture into material and spiritual domains and staked an early claim to the spiritual sphere, represented by religion, caste, women and the family, and peasants, Chatterjee shows how middle-class elites first imagined the nation into being in this spiritual dimension and then readied it for political contest, all the while, quote, normalizing, end quote, the aspirations of the various marginal groups that typify the spiritual sphere. While Chatterjee's specific examples are drawn from Indian sources with a copious use of Bengali language material, the book is a contribution to the general theoretical discussion on nationalism and the modern state, examining the paradoxes involved with creating first a uniquely non-Western nation in the spiritual sphere, and then a universalist nation-state in the material sphere. The author finds that the search for a post-colonial modernity is necessarily linked with the past struggles against modernity. Back to the text. The ambivalences of this position are evident in part that Chatterjee's classic study of cultural nationalism, which posits a methodological and historical difference between the, quote, external orientation of colonial nationalism and the, quote, internal life of everyday cultural tradition. For Chatterjee, the difference remains critical to any politics of resistance, even if it must be considered a creation of colonial rule. Quote, the crucial break in the history of anti-colonial nationalism comes when the colonized refuse to accept membership of this civil society of subjects. They construct their national identities within a different narrative of that of the community. They do not have the option of doing this within the domain of bourgeois civil institutions. They create consequently a very different domain, a cultural domain, marked by the distinction of the material and the spiritual, the outer and the inner. This inner domain of culture is declared the sovereign territory of the nation, where the colonial state is not allowed entry, even as the outer domain is surrendered to the colonial power. The rhetoric here is of ... love, kinship, austerity, sacrifice, end quote. Chatterjee, The Nation and Its Fragments. It is clear that for Chatterjee, the assertion of an inner domain of culture, counter to the outer domain of the colonial public sphere, has continued to function as a source of, quote, passive resistance, in the Gramscian style, to the victories of developmental nationalism. It is this cultural nationalism, as opposed to civic or state nationalism, that Chatterjee charges with the task of renewing anti-capitalist critique in the post-colonial era. The, quote, real unsurpassed contradiction in Western social philosophy, end quote, insists Chatterjee, lies not so much in the opposition between, quote, state and civil society, end quote, but rather between, quote, capital and community, end quote. Chatterjee. But by positioning the, quote, inner domain, end quote, of cultural tradition as the essence of the nation, fundamentally distinct from and immune to the outer structure of politico-economic statecraft, Chatterjee seems to overlook the fact that such a division of spheres was itself an effect of the late imperial practice of, quote, indirect rule, with its insistence on respect for the essential differences of native culture, belief, and kinship structures. Footnote. See Karuna Mantina, Alibis of Empire, Henry Maine and the Ends of Liberal Imperialism, published in 2010, and Ritu Birla, Stages of Capital, Law, Culture, and Market Governments in Late Colonial India, published in 2009. End footnote. In the present context, moreover, Chatterjee's assertion of the claims of cultural nationalism over and above those of states runs the risk of merely rehearsing the impasses of contemporary post-colonial politics. The Hindu nationalist movement, for example, has abandoned its historical commitment to economic nationalism. At the same time, it has intensified its claims to sovereignty in the realm of culture, religion, and family. Far from confirming the, quote, real opposition, unquote, between capital and community, Hindu nationalism bears witness to the structural alliance between economic liberalization and cultural nationalism. The political affiliations of the anthropologist Talal Asad are somewhat more decisive. Talal Asad, born 1932, is a Saudi-born cultural anthropologist who is currently Distinguished Professor Emeritus of Anthropology and Middle Eastern Studies at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. Talal Asad's prolific body of work mainly focuses on religiosity, Middle Eastern studies, post-colonialism, and notions of power, law, and discipline. Talal Asad is known for his writing calling for an anthropology of secularism. Talal Asad's work has had a significant influence beyond his home discipline of anthropology. As Donovan Schaefer writes, quote, "The gravitational field of Talal Asad's influence has emanated far from his home discipline and reshaped the landscape of other humanistic disciplines around him." Back to the text. Footnote: Talal Asad's piece Appendix, The Trouble of Thinking, an interview with Talal Asad in The Powers of the Secular Modern, Talal Asad and His Interlocutors, edited by David Scott and Charles Hirschkind, published in 2006. Here Talal Asad expresses his admiration for the Islamist movements that gained popular support in Egypt and Sudan in the late 70s and early 80s. Distancing himself from the more tactical alliances adopted by secular nationalists or Marxists, Talal Asad professes a genuine sympathy for the religious impulses behind such movements. Back to the text, end footnote. Like Milbank, Talal Asad is guided by a quasi-theological desire to purify his object of study of all merely cultural interpretations, a desire he shares with Salafi currents of contemporary Islam. The Salafi movement, or Salafism, is a revival movement within Sunni Islam, which was formed as a socio-religious movement during the late 19th century and has remained influential in the Islamic world for over a century. The name Salafiyya is a self-designation to call for a return to the traditions of the, quote, pious predecessors, the first three generations of Muslims, the Islamic prophet Muhammad and the Sahaba, his companions, then the Tabi'in, and the third generation of the Tabi al-Tabi'in, who are believed to exemplify the pure form of Islam. In practice, Salafis claim that they rely on the Quran, the Sunnah, and the Ijma consensus of the Salaf, giving these writings precedence over what they claim as, quote, later religious interpretations, end quote. The Salafi movement aimed to achieve a renewal of Muslim life and had a major influence on many Muslim thinkers and movements across the Islamic world. Salafi Muslims oppose bid'ah, religious innovation, and support the implementation of Sharia, Islamic law. In its approach to politics, the Salafi movement is sometimes divided by Western academics and journalists into three categories. The largest group being Puritist or Quietist, who avoid politics, the second largest group being the activists, who maintain regular involvement in politics, and the third group being the jihadists, who form a minority and advocate armed struggle to restore the early Islamic movement. In legal matters, Salafis usually advocate ijtihad, independent reasoning, and oppose taqlid, adherence to the 4 or 5 schools, madhahib, of Islamic jurisprudence, while some remain largely faithful to them, but do not restrict themselves to the, quote, final, end quote, edicts of any specific madhab. The origins of Salafism are disputed, with some historians like Louis Massignon tracing its origin to the intellectual movement in the second half of the 19th century that opposed westernization emanating from European imperialism, led by al-Afghani, Muhammad Abdu, and Rashid Rida. However, Afghani and Abdu had not self-described as, quote, Salafi, and the usage of the term to denote them has become outdated today. Abdu's more orthodox student, Rashid Rida, followed hardline Salafism, which opposed Sufism, Shiism, and incorporated traditional madhab system. Rida eventually became a champion of the Wahhabi movement and would influence another strand of conservative Salafis. In the modern academia, Salafism is commonly used to refer to a cluster of contemporary Sunni renewal and reform movements inspired by the teachings of classical theologians, in particular Ibn Taymiyyah, who lived from 1263 to 1328 CE. These Salafis dismissed the 19th century reformers as rationalists who failed to interpret Scripture in the most literal traditional sense. Conservative Salafis regard Syrian scholars like Rashid Rida and Muhib al-Khatib as revivalists of Salafi thought in the Arab world. Rida's religious orientation was shaped by his association with Syrian, Hanbali, and Salafi scholars who preserved the tradition of Ibn Taymiyyah. These ideas would be popularized by Rida and his disciples, immensely influencing numerous Salafi organizations in the Arab world. Back to the text. As such, Talal Asad has been concerned not only with describing the practical enforcement of orthodoxy within actually existing Islam, via a sympathetic account of the role of the ulama in Saudi Arabia, for example, but also with implementing orthodoxy as a theoretical and political method. I think this is what's being referred to here as the Council of Senior Scholars in Saudi Arabia. The Council of Senior Scholars, also known as the Senior Council of Ulama. Okay, never mind, here we are. Ulama, in Islam, the ulama, the quote, learned ones, end quote, also spelled ulema, U-L-E-M-A, or scholars of Islamic doctrine and law. They are considered the guardians, transmitters, and interpreters of religious knowledge in Islam. Ulama may refer broadly to the educated class of such religious scholars, including theologians, canon lawyers, muftis, judges, qadis, professors, high state religious officials. Alternatively, ulama may refer specifically to those holding governmental positions in an Islamic state. By long-standing tradition, ulama are educated in religious institutions, madrasas. The Quran and Sunnah, authentic hadith, are the scriptural sources of traditional Islamic law. Back to the text. This move is nowhere more apparent than in Talal Asad's critique of anthropologists who have adopted a more ecumenical approach to the study of actually existing Islams. I always forget what ecumenical means. Okay, like interfaith. Refers to like interfaith shit. Back to the text. In the face of such deviations, Assad's response is emphatic. Islam is nothing if not orthodoxy, nothing if not a method for establishing the correct relationship between a tradition of textual authority and the performance of everyday ritual. Quote, orthodoxy is crucial to all Islamic traditions. ... Orthodoxy is not a mere body of opinions, but a distinctive relationship, a relationship of power. Wherever Muslims have the power to regulate, uphold, require, or adjust correct practices, and to condemn, exclude, undermine, or replace incorrect ones, there is the domain of orthodoxy. End quote. Tala Assad. It is true that Assad and his followers substitute a culturalism of practice for a culturalism of essence, a deft move that preempts the critique of essentialism while retaining the normative, indeed legislative force of tradition. Against the charge of cultural essentialism, Assad and his followers offer the retort that orthodoxy must be performed, a mobilization of Judith Butler's performance theory, minus the subversion, that Butler herself seems to approve of. But the recourse to performance theory does not make their appeal to cultural tradition any less implacable. On the contrary, the notion that cultural tradition must be performed, enacted, and made visible in order to sustain itself places a constant burden of proof on those who are supposed to belong to its strictures. If tradition is not inherited in essence, it follows that orthodoxy must be relentlessly incited and policed in practice. It goes without saying that women are assigned a literally fundamental role in the reproduction of such orthodoxies. Mahmud's Politics of Piety. Mahmud's Politics of Piety, an ethnographic study of women engaged in faith-based social welfare and proselytization, dawah, in Cairo, represents a now classic apologia for right-wing female activism. So, dawah, or invitation, is the act of inviting people to Islam. The plural is dawat, or da'awat. The Politics of Piety, Islamic Revival and the Feminist Subject by Samba Mahmoud, which received praise from Cynthia Nelson, Charles Taylor, Leila Abu Lughad, Judith Butler, Steve Catton, and yeah, that's it. The overview says, Politics of Piety is a groundbreaking analysis of Islamist cultural politics through the ethnography of a thriving grassroots women piety movement in the mosques of Cairo, Egypt. Unlike those organized Islamist activities that seek to seize or transform the state, this is a moral reform movement whose orthodox practices are commonly viewed as inconsequential to Egypt's political landscape. Samba Mahmoud's compelling exposition of these practices challenges this assumption by showing how the ethical and political are indelibly linked within the context of such movements. Not only is this book a sensitive ethnography of a critical but largely ignored dimension of the Islamic revival, it is also an unflinching critique of the secular liberal assumptions by which some people hold such movements to account. The book addresses three central questions. How do movements of moral reform help us rethink the normative liberal account of politics? How does the adherence of women to the patriarchal norms at the core of such movements parochialize key assumptions within feminist theory about freedom, agency, authority, and the human subject? How does a consideration of debates about embodied religious rituals among Islamists and their secular critics help us understand the conceptual relationship between bodily form and political imaginaries? Politics of Piety is essential reading for anyone interested in issues at the nexus of ethics and politics, embodiment and gender, liberalism and post-colonialism. Back to the text. Footnote: Saba Mahmud, Politics of Piety, the Islamic Revival, and the Feminist Subject. For pertinent critiques of Mahmud's relationship to the Salafi movement, see Sindre Bangstad, Saba Mahmud and Anthropological Feminism After Virtue, published in Theory and Culture in May 2011, and the excellent piece by Sama Salim, book review, The Politics of Piety, the Islamic Revival and Feminist Subject, in Jadaliya, published in 2010. End footnote. Saba Mahmud's study focuses on 6 women's Dawa groups aligned with various factions of Salafism, the purist ideology that claims to reinstate the earliest and most authentic tradition of Sunni Islam in opposition to all merely cultural and folkloric corruptions of the faith. Although one would never guess it from Mahmud's account, the Salafi religious societies were financed by Anwar Sadat during the 1970s as a counterforce to the Marxist, Nasserist, and non-aligned left. During this period, they established a presence in student unions and local communities through the provision of social welfare and the creation of urban militias committed to policing the boundaries of everyday morality. Quote, the struggle against moral corruption, al-Fasad al-Akhlaqi. Fasad, F-A-S-A-D, is an Arabic word meaning rottenness, corruption, or depravity. In an Islamic context, fasad can refer to spreading corruption on earth or spreading mischief in a Muslim land, moral corruption against God, or disturbance of the public peace. The spread of fasad is a major theme in the Quran, and the notion is often contrasted with Islam, setting things aright. Classical Quranic commentators commonly interpreted, quote, corruption in the land, end quote, as open disobedience against God or its result. In certain contexts, classical jurists took it to refer to the legal category of hiraba, comprising armed assault, rape, and murder. Some contemporary Muslims view destruction of the natural environment to be among the central meanings of verses referring to fasad. In recent decades, the term has been used in the legal codes of the Islamic republics of Pakistan and Iran. In Iran, laws referencing fasad have been used to prosecute or threaten political opposition figures. Okay, so back to the text. Quote, the struggle against moral corruption, al-Fasad al-Akhlaqi explains Rollmeier, quote, adopted the form of disrupting music performances, intervening in the showing of Western films, as well as preventing other corrupt forms of corruption, liquor stores, video shops, and mixed-gender trips of students. The internet says Raoul Meijer, or Major, Meiger, is historian and teaches history and political science of the modern Middle East and North Africa and modern Islamic political thought. Meijer has published widely on social movements, modern Islamic political thought, Salafism, and social and political processes of transition in the Middle East and North Africa. During the past years, Meijer has concentrated on the history of the concept of citizenship in the Middle East and North Africa. He is also a freelancer and has published several reports for the Dutch MFA. So back to the text. Footnote, Rollmeier, commanding right and forbidding wrong is a principle of social action. The case of the Egyptian al-Jama al-Islamiyya in the book Global Salafism, Islam's New Religious Movement, edited by Raoul Meijer, or Major, published at Columbia University Press in 2009, for analysis that focused on the militant phase of Salafi insurgency during the 1990s, see Mohammed M. Hafez and Quentin Wiktorowicz, Violence as Contention in the Egyptian Islamic Movement, in Islamic Activism, in the book Islamic Activism, a Social Movement Theory Approach, edited by Quentin Wiktorowicz. For an analysis that focuses especially on the role of women in the Salafi movement, see Ghada Hashem Tawhami, The Mobilization of Muslim Women in Egypt, published in 1996. End footnote. It also extended to physical attacks against leftist students, Sufis, and Copts. Sufism is a mystic body of religious practice found within Islam, which is characterized by a focus on Islamic purification, spirituality, ritualism, and asceticism. Practitioners of Sufism are referred to as Sufis and historically typically belong to, quote, orders known as tariqa, congregations formed around a grand wali, who would be the last in a chain of successive teachers linking back to Muhammad with the goal of undergoing tazkiyah, self-purification, and the hope of reaching the spiritual station of ihsan. The ultimate aim of Sufis is to seek the pleasure of God by endeavoring to return to their original state of purity and natural disposition known as fitra. Sufism emerged early on in Islamic history, partly as a reaction against the worldliness of the early Umayyad Caliphate from 661 to 750, and mainly under the tutelage of Hassan al-Basri. Although Sufis were opposed to dry legalism, they strictly observed Islamic law and belonged to various schools of Islamic jurisprudence and theology. Although the overwhelming majority of Sufis, both pre-modern and modern, remained adherents of Sunni Islam, certain strands of Sufi thought transferred over to the ambits of Shia Islam during the late medieval period. This particularly happened after the Safavid conversion of Iran under the concept of Irfan. Important focuses of Sufi worship include dhikr, the practice of remembrance of God, Sufis also played an important role in spreading Islam through their missionary and educational activities. Despite a relative decline of Sufi orders in the modern era and attacks from fundamentalist Islamic movements such as Salafism and Wahhabism, Sufism has continued to play an important role in the Islamic world. It has also influenced various forms of spirituality in the West and generated significant academic interest. And also COPS, C-O-P-T-S, if my internet will cooperate with me. This fucking thing. I apologize. Oh my god. Internet is so bad. Alright, I'll go back to COPS and I'll just keep looking things up and then I'll have to go back. During the latter part of the 1980s, the Salafis assumed a more militant form and began to engage in acts of armed violence against members of parliament, intellectuals, writers, and foreign tourists, culminating in the terrorist attack that killed 58 tourists and 4 Egyptians in 1997. What distinguishes the Salafi current of Islam from its more institutional rival, the Muslim Brotherhood, is the appeal to Hizbah, observance of Islamic law, as a principle of extra-parliamentary violence. Drawing on the classic text of Ibn Taymiyyah, the Salafis argue that it is the prerogative of every pious subject to enjoin good and forbid evil, without the sanction of the state and, if necessary, through the use of force. Footnote: on the notion of enjoining good and prohibiting evil, al-amr bil maruf wal nahi an al-munkar, in Salafi thought, see Mahmud, Politics of Piety, Salwa Ismail, Rethinking Islamist Politics, Culture of the State and Islamism, and Mayer, the Commanding Right and Forbidding Wrong, the article Commanding Right and Forbidding Wrong. End footnote. When the state began clamping down on their militant activities in the late 90s, however, the group changed its focus from conventional forms of armed violence to the inculcation of virtue through welfare and quotidian forms of vigilantism. As noted by Mahmud, Dawah, or proselytization, was to replace Amr bil Maruf, enjoining good and prohibiting evil, as the principle of Salafi activism. In practice, argues Salwa Ismail, the turn to Dawah meant that Islamist forces were now almost exclusively focused on the policing of sexuality, especially female sexuality in public space. Hisbah, now understood as a total transformation of social life through the imposition of strict laws of sexual conduct, was to be achieved through the ostensibly quietist means of social welfare and the pervasive surveillance of street life. Under the banner of Hisbah, the Salafis not only stepped up their attacks on liquor stores, cinemas, and video shops displaying images of the female form, they also sought to legislate the everyday movements of women in the street. Violations of this moral code were punished by physical force. Footnote: Ismail, Rethinking Islamist Politics. It is such practices of dawah, presented in overwhelming pastel hues in her Politics of Piety, that inform Mahmud's fascinating new ethics of female virtue. Okay, so I can now access the internet, and some of the references that I looked up that I have up on my computer one is for the Luxor massacre. The Luxor massacre was a terrorist attack that occurred on the 17th of November 1997 in Egypt. The Luxor massacre was perpetrated by Al-Jama al-Islamiyya and resulted in the deaths of 62 people, most of whom were tourists. It took place at Deir al-Bari, an archaeological site located across the Nile from the city of Luxor. The next piece I have up is for Enjoying Good and Forbidding Wrong. Enjoying good and forbidding wrong, enjoining, not enjoying, enjoining good and forbidding wrong are two important duties imposed by God in Islam as revealed in the Quran and Hadith. Quote, the term that best helps us to understand the nature of Quran ethical perspectives is maruf, as it appears 38 times in slightly varying forms in the Quran, and they are important because of the duties imposed on believers through these words. Also, traditional commentators oppose the association of maruf with its cognate urf, quote, custom, end quote. Although most common translations of the phrase is, quote, good and evil, end quote, the words used by Islamic philosophy in determining good and evil discourses are husn and qub. It is in its most common usage, ma'ruf is, quote, in accordance with the custom, end quote, while munkar, which has no place in the custom as its opposite, singular, nukar, in today's religious expression, ma'ruf sunnah, this concept was not different from custom in the beginning. Munkar is meant as a bid'ah. A related topic is istihsan. Some jurists classify human behavior, ahkam, and link the definition of good and evil to this classification. In theory, what Allah sees as good is good, and what Allah sees as bad is bad. However, this classification reflected their interpretation and understandings on Sharia. This expression is the base of the classical Islamic institution of Hisbah, the individual or collective duty, depending on the Islamic school of law, to intervene and enforce Islamic law. It forms a central part of the Islamic doctrine for Muslims. The injunctions also constitute 2 of the 10 ancillaries of the faith of Twelver Shi'ism. Pre-modern Islamic literature describes pious Muslims, usually scholars, taking action to forbid wrong by destroying forbidden objects, particularly liquor, and those who had the view that certain types of musical instruments are haram. In the contemporary Muslim world, various state or parastatal bodies, often with phrases like, quote, the promotion of virtue and the prevention of vice, end quote, in their titles, have appeared in Iran, Saudi Arabia, Nigeria, Sudan, Malaysia, etc., at various times and with various levels of power, to combat sinful activities and compel virtuous activities. However, Saudi authorities have recently made it clear that men and women can coexist in public areas in Islam. They paved the way by organizing concert and sport events open for the public. The next thing that I have pulled up is maruf, or maruf, I'm not sure how you say it, M-A-apostrophe R-U-F. Maruf is an Islamic term, the term that helps us to quote, the term that best helps us to understand the nature of Quran ethical prescriptions is maruf, a word that appears repeatedly, parentheses, in slightly varying forms in the Quran, end quote, and used 38 times in the Quran. The word is most often found in the Quranic exhortation, often translated as enjoin the good and forbid the wrong. Maruf and munkar are widely discussed because of the duties of the Quran, imposes on believers through these concepts. Maruf is seen as a key word in moral understanding of the Quran, and traditional commentators oppose the association of maruf with its cognate urf, quote, custom. Although most common translations of the phrase is, quote, good, end quote, the words used by Islamic philosophy in determining good and evil discourses are husn and qub. In its most common usage, maruf is, quote, in accordance with the custom, end quote, while munkar, which has no place in the custom, as its opposite, singular nukar, or nuker, N-U-K-R. In today's religious expression, maruf sunnah, this concept was not different from custom in the beginning. Munkar is meant as bidah, a related topic, istisan. However, today, according to the meanings attributed to the term, with meaning expansions that are not based on etymological connection, the word can be used as, quote, well-known, universally accepted, that which is good, beneficial, fairness, equity, equitableness, end quote. Pre-modern Islamic literature describes pious Muslims, usually scholars, taking action to forbid wrong by destroying forbidden objects, particularly liquor and musical instruments. In the contemporary Muslim world, various state or parastatal bodies, often with phrases like the promotion of virtue and the prevention of vice in their titles, have appeared in Iran, Saudi Arabia, Nigeria, Sudan, Malaysia, etc., at various times and with various levels of power. Ibn Taymiyyah lived from 1263 to 1328 and was a Sunni Muslim scholar, jurist, traditionalist, ascetic, proto-Salafi, and iconoclastic theologian. Ibn Taymiyyah is known for his diplomatic involvement with the Ilkhanid ruler Ghazan Khan and at the Battle of Marj al-Safar, which ended the Mongol invasion of the Levant. Invasions, plural, of the Levant. A legal jurist of the Hanbali school, Ibn Taymiyyah's condemnation of numerous folk practices associated with saint veneration and visitation of tombs made him a contentious figure with many rulers and scholars of the time, which caused him to be imprisoned several times as a result. A polarizing figure in his own time and the centuries that followed, Ibn Taymiyyah has emerged as one of the most influential medieval scholars in late modern Sunni Islam. He is also noteworthy for engaging in fierce religious polemics that attacked various schools of speculative theology, primarily Ash'arism and Turidism, while defending the doctrines of authorism. This prompted rival clerics and state authorities to accuse the Taymiyya and his disciples of anthropomorphism, which eventually led to the censoring of his works and subsequent incarceration. Nevertheless, Ibn Taymiyya's numerous treatises that advocated for al-Salafiyya al-I'tiqadiyya, creedal Salafism, based on his scholarly interpretations of the Quran and prophetic way, constitute the most popular classical reference for later Salafi movements. Throughout his treatises, Ibn Taymiyya asserted there is no contradiction between reason and revelation, and denounced the usage of philosophy as a prerequisite in seeking religious truth. As a cleric who viewed Shiaism as a source of corruption in Muslim societies, Ibn Taymiyya was also known for virulent anti-Shia polemics throughout treatises such as Minhaj al-Sunnah, wherein he denounced the Imami Shia creed as heretical. He issued a ruling to wage jihad against the Shias of Kisrawan and personally fought in the Kisrawan campaigns themselves, accusing Shias of acting as the fifth columnists of the Frank Crusaders and Mongol Ilkhanids. Within recent history, Ibn Taymiyya has been widely regarded as a major scholarly influence in revolutionary Islamist movements such as Salafi jihadism. Major aspects of his teaching, such as upholding the pristine monotheism of the early Muslim generations and campaigns to uproot what he regarded as polytheism, had a profound influence on Muhammad ibn Abd al-Wahhab, the founder of the Wahhabism reform movement formed in the Arabian Peninsula, as well as other late Sunni scholars. Syrian Salafi theologian Muhammad Rashid Rida, one of the major proponents of Ibn Taymiyya's works, designated him as the Mujaddid of the 7th Islamic century. Ibn Taymiyya's original positions, such as his excommunication of the Mongol Ilkhanids and allowing jihad against other self-professed Muslims, were referred to by later Islamist political movements, including the Muslim Brotherhood, Hizb ut-Tahrir, Al-Qaeda, and Islamic State, to justify social uprisings against contemporary governments of the Muslim world. And finally, Copts. Copts are a Christian ethno-religious group, COPTS, are a Christian religious group indigenous to North Africa, who have primarily inhabited the area of modern Egypt and Sudan since antiquity. The Copts are the largest Christian denomination in Egypt and the Middle East, as well as in Sudan and Libya. Copts in Egypt account for roughly 5 to 15% of the Egyptian population. Copts in Sudan account for 1% of the Sudanese population, while Copts in Libya similarly account for 1% of the Libyan population. Originally referring to all Egyptians, the term Copt became synonymous with native Christians in light of Egypt's Islamization and Arabization after the Muslim conquest of Egypt in the 7th century. Copts have historically spoken the Coptic language, a direct descendant of the Demotic Egyptian that was spoken in late antiquity. Following the Muslim conquest of Egypt in 639-646 AD, the treatment of the Coptic Christians who refused to convert ranged from relative tolerance to open persecution. Historically, the Copts suffered from, quote, waves of persecution giving way to relative tolerance and cycles that varied according to the local ruler and other political and economic circumstances. Persecution is significantly involved in the Copts' ethnic identity due to historic and current conflicts. Most Copts adhere to the Coptic Orthodox Church of Alexandria, an Oriental Orthodox Church. The smaller Coptic Catholic Church is an Eastern Catholic Church in communion with the Holy See of Rome. Others belong to the Evangelical Church of Egypt. The Copts played a central role in the Arab Renaissance, as well as the modernization of Egypt and the Arab world as a whole. The Copts also contributed to the, quote, social and political life in key debates such as Pan-Arabism, good governments, educational reform, and democracy, end quote. And they have historically flourished in business affairs. While Coptic Christians speak the same dialects and are culturally similar to other Egyptians, Coptic Christians strongly oppose Arab identity and associate it with Islam and Islamism. In Egypt, Copts have a relatively higher educational attainment, a relatively higher wealth index, and a stronger representation in white-collar job types, but limited representation in military and security agencies. The majority of demographic, socioeconomic, and health indicators are similar among Christians and Muslims. Okay, sorry about having to read all those in a row like that, but you know. The internet doesn't like to work for old me. Salafism is a political formation of the far right, one that is singularly, this is back to the text. Salafism is a political formation of the far right, one that is singularly focused on the sacralization of virtuous womanhood. It is therefore hardly surprising that women should be active agents of the Salafi politics of moral purification, even when its disciplinary force is directed toward other, immoral, religious, or otherly religious women. The focus on women's activism is one of the novel contributions to Mahmud's study. Yet the fact that Mahmud seeks to derive a, quote, ethics of virtue, end quote, from the practice of dawah suggests that her enthusiasm for the Salafi movement goes beyond the professional empathy of the ethnographer, questionable as the latter may be as a method for investigating the far right. Why then have so many prominent political theorists and more than a few queer theorists been falling all over themselves to endorse Mahmud's ethics of female piousness? It's hard to know precisely what motivates such affiliations, apart from a sense that U.S. imperial politics demands some urgent, indiscriminate gesture of reparation on behalf of its victims. Perhaps these alliances depend on a certain ignorance of the spectrum of anti-imperialist politics beyond the shores of the United States, or an all too credulous acceptance of the discourse of cultural anti-imperialism, so often the province of the post-colonial right. Or perhaps they are inspired by a genuine return to positions closer to those of Christian feminism, which is itself enjoying something of a revival at the moment, and often in the very terms proposed by Mahmud. The figure of the, quote, Muslim woman, end quote, will have served as the unwitting alibi for a revival of Puritan feminism and a return to pre-sex war positions in gender politics, often at the expense of Muslim women who fail to be pious and, quote, non-Western as, quote, one would like. Alternatively, such sympathies at a distance might be understood as offshore accounts in which one can conveniently deposit the kinds of political investment one would prefer not to publicize at home. A personal turn to the right can be safely detoured via an unimpeachable sympathy for pious women in downtown Cairo, whose precise political affiliations one can leave unscrutinized. In any case, it would be optimistic to think that such investments are without consequence. In Britain, for example, at about the time Mahmud was deploring the failure of, quote, secular leftists, end quote, to open themselves up to with Islamist anti-imperialists, both the Foreign Office and the Stop the War /Respect Socialist Workers' Party coalition were busily courting the favors of the traditionalist conservative Muslim Brotherhood and, to their right, the Pakistani Jamaat-e-Islami. Jamaat-e-Islami, which is my best guess at the pronunciation, is an Islamist fundamentalist movement founded in 1941 in British India by the Islamist author, theorist, and socio-political philosopher Syed Abu Allah Maududi, who was inspired by the Muslim Brotherhood. Jamaat-e-Islami is considered one of the most influential Islamist organizations and was the first to develop an ideology based on the modern revolutionary conception of Islam. Jamaat-e-Islami's founding branch in Pakistan is the nation's largest fundamentalist party. Jamaat-e-Islami was founded to spread Islamic values across the Indian subcontinent and advocate for an Islamic political system. It was formed on the 26th of August 1941 in Lahore under the leadership of Maududi, who believed that contemporary political ideologies resulted from Western imperialism and that it was necessary to implement Sharia law to preserve Muslim culture. Maududi believed politics was, quote, an integral, inseparable part of the Islamic faith, end quote, and that Islamic ideology and non-Islamic ideologies such as capitalism and socialism, liberalism, or secularism were most mutually exclusive. He saw the creation of an Islamic state as both act of piety and a cure for social and economic problems faced by Muslims, which he attributed to Western influence. Jamaat-e-Islami opposed the partition of India and the creation of Pakistan and actively worked to prevent it. After the partition of India, the organization spearheaded the movement to transform Pakistan from a Muslim homeland into an Islamic state. Maududi's efforts focused on transforming to a, quote, theodemocracy, end quote, based on the Sharia, which would enforce things like abolition of interest-bearing banks, sexual separation, veiling of women, hudud penalties for theft, adultery, and other crimes. Jamaat seeks to spur an Islamic revival, implementing Islam as a universal religion. Jamaat-e-Islami is banned in the state of Jammu and Kashmir in India and has historically faced bans in Bangladesh, most recently in 2024. Since 2003, the organization is designated as terrorist by Russia. Back to the text. The congruence between the post-colonial right and official multiculturalism is by now a familiar phenomenon. The kind of state multiculturalism promoted by the parliamentary left and right has in practice tended to corroborate the most vocal claims to cultural representativeness, repeatedly privileging the Hindu and Islamic right as the authentic voices of cultural difference to the detriment of other dissident tendencies on the, quote, Asian, end quote, left. But what are we to make of the contemporary alliances between the anti-imperialist Leninist far left and the post-colonial far right? Is anti-liberalism a sufficient cause for communion between the far left and the far right? Or do such alliances signal a deeper convergence of political passions reminiscent of the 1930s? The fact that novel and more or less potent configurations of the radical right have proliferated alongside the introduction of neoliberal economic reform throughout the world in post-welfarist, post-colonial, and post-socialist contexts alike demands that we revisit the question of fascism and its relationship to the historical development of capital. Ijaz Ahmad, one of the most perceptive analysts of the post-colonial Hindu and Islamist far right, has suggested that the purest historiographical understanding of fascism, which in extreme cases would reserve the term for the mid-20th century Mussolini regime, must be extended to account for the multiple historical and contemporary permutations of the far right. Footnote, see Ijaz Ahmad on Communalism and Globalization, Offenses of the Far Right, Zeev Sternhell develops a similar critique of historical accounts of fascism, quote fascism, that identified German National Socialism as the only true form of fascism. Sternhell goes so far as to argue that biological racism was not the common denominator of mid-20th century European fascisms. See Zeev Sternhell, The Birth of Fascist Ideology, published in 1994. Amir Mufti widens the frame still further by examining the problematic of Muslim, quote, minoritization, end quote, in post-colonial India in light of the emblematic experience of Jewish minoritization, quote, minoritization in post-Enlightenment Europe. The value of such an intervention is that it accounts for both the structural nature and hence transposability of the relationship between capital, the modern state, and, quote, minoritization, end quote, and corresponding temptation to reassert tradition from a position of, quote, minoritization. See Amir R. Mufti, Enlightenment in the Colony, the Jewish Question, and the Crisis of Post-Colonial Culture, published in 2007. And, according to Wikipedia, Ijaz Ahmad lived from 1941 to 1941 to 2022, and was an Indian-born American Marxist philosopher, literary theorist, and political commentator. He was the Chancellor's Professor at the University of California, Irvine School of Humanities, Department of Comparative Literature. Back to the text. The word fascism would then refer to, quote, certain forms of politics that have been with us on the global scale since roughly the 1880s, which is also the moment of the birth of modern imperialism on the one hand, and the moment of emergence of mass working class parties on the other, end quote. Fascism would designate a, quote, generalized tendency throughout the history of imperialism, but a tendency that takes different forms in different national conditions, end quote. Ahmad. Critical to the historical formation of fascism has been a complex and rivalrous relationship to the anti-capitalist far left. As Zeev Sternhell has remarked of the European far right of the early 20th century, fascism inhabits and nullifies the forces of revolutionary Marxism by turning anti-capitalism and anti-imperialism, in the case of German National Socialism, into a project of ethnic religious purification. For this reason, Sternhell locates the intellectual origins of fascism in the philosophy of divine violence, espoused by the French and Italian Sorelians, who within the space of a few short years moved from the anti-parliamentary far left to the Catholic far right. Zeev Sternhell, who lived from 1935 to 2020, was a Polish-born Israeli historian, political scientist, commentator on the Israeli-Palestine conflict, and writer. He was one of the world's leading theorists of the phenomenon of fascism. Sternhell headed the Department of Political Science at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and wrote for the Haaretz newspaper. Back to the text, quote, if the fascist ideology cannot be described as a simple response to Marxism, end quote, writes Sternhell, quote, fascist ideology's origins, on the other hand, were the direct result of a very specific revision of Marxism. It was a revision of Marxism and not a variety of Marxism or a consequence of Marxism, end quote. Sternhell, The Birth of Fascist Ideology. Fascism, that is to say, takes up Marxism's call for total revolution of the social order, while forcibly resolving the fractures of class, race, and gender, and the assertion of some greater genealogical entity, parenthesis, nation, family, or community of faith, end parenthesis. By displacing the specter of surplus labor exploitation onto the figure of surplus population, fascism promises a final solution to the irresolvable contradictions opened up by Marxist critique, one that leaves the structural premises of capital otherwise untouched. From the vantage point of the early 21st century, a similarly complex relationship can be discerned between the various complexions of the post-colonial far right that surfaced during the 1970s and the revolutionary or nationalist Marxisms that preceded them. Historically much weaker than their Marxist rivals, Hindu nationalism and Salafi Islamism have in important respects revised and deflected the anti-capitalism of the Marxist far left by combining the latter's revolutionary elan with a form of cultural nativism. In both cases, the appeal to some primordial notion of religious tradition serves to obscure the internal fractures of the nation, while concentrating the force of anti-imperialist critique onto some internal or external figure of pathological surplus. Even while it embraces the strategy of economic liberalization, Hindu nationalism rehabilitates the discourse of anti-colonialism in a purely cultural register, translating the critique of imperialist geopolitics into a much more intimate threat of invasion, identified on the one hand with the phantasmatic figure of the Muslim, quote, foreigner, and on the other with the insidious moral corruption represented by Western culture. A similar strategy was pursued by the Egyptian state under Sadat, who blatantly cultivated the reactionary anti-capitalism of the Salafi far right at the very moment he embraced the politics of economic infita. The hell is infita? According to Wikipedia, infita, or Law 43 of 1974, was Egyptian President Anwar Sadat's policy of, quote, opening the door, end quote, to private investment in Egypt in the years following the 1973 October War, or Yom Kippur War with Israel. Infita was accompanied by a break with longtime ally and aid giver the USSR, which was replaced by the United States, and by a peace process with Israel symbolized by Sadat's dramatic flight to Jerusalem in 1977. Infita ended the domination of Egypt's economy by the public sector and encouraged both domestic and foreign investment in the private sector. The Egyptian armies crossing over the Suez Canal in the October 1973 Yom Kippur War, which despite Egypt's eventual defeat was seen by many as a political victory for its initial successes, and gave Sadat the prestige to initiate a major reversal of Gamal Abdel Nasser's policies. So that's infita. In practice, Salafi Islamism coexisted perfectly with the project of economic liberalization. While neoliberal economic restructuring promotes the feminization and informalization of labor, Islamism responds with a moral critique of sexual corruption, serving to reestablish the gendered hierarchies of the expanded household through the instrument of social welfare. Footnote: it should be noted that the Egyptian Revolution of 2011 was the fruit of more than half a decade of labor militantism, set off by an autonomous strike led by women mill factory workers in 2006. Both the Salafis and the Muslim Brotherhood have been highly critical of such labor activism. End footnote. Herein lies the crucial difference with respect to the fascisms of the early 20th century. While the mid-20th century fascist state combined the economic form of monopoly capitalism with national protectionism, with the racial politics of the authoritarian welfare state, the neo-fascisms today are characterized by the alliance between economic neoliberalism and moral absolutism, channeled through the infrastructures of faith-based welfare. Footnote: on the alliance between economic neoliberalism and religiously inflected social welfare, in contemporary Cairo, see Salwa Ismail, Political Life in Cairo's New Quarters, Encountering the Everyday State, published with University of Minnesota Press, 2006, on the comparative more recent strategies of social welfare adopted by the Hindu far right. See Christoph Yafralat, his article, Hindu Nationalism and Social Welfare Strategy, in the book Development, Civil Society, and Faith-Based Organizations, edited by Gerard Clark and Michael Jennings, published in 2008. End footnote. In both cases, the instrument of social welfare serves as an internal solution to the economic effects wrought by the state's compliance with the dominant form of capital. If we are to have any hope at all of understanding, and more importantly, escaping such convergences, it is urgent that we move beyond the mythological conceptions of civilizational differences, Western versus non-Western, secular liberal versus religious anti-liberal, that populate so much contemporary theory. Such taxonomies are not only parasitic on the discourse of the religious right, American or otherwise, they're also historical nonsenses. How, for example, does the premise of a hegemonic Western secularism, masking the covert Christian provenance of the Western state form, even begin to account for the numerous instances of overt religious nationalism and statehood in 20th century Europe? We must conclude that Salazar's Estado Novo in Portugal, the Franco dictatorship in Spain, the Metaxas regime in Greece, Rexism in Belgium, Ireland's blue shirts and green shirts, Action Française and Vichy regime are exceptions to the rule? How does the presumptive religiosity of the non-West, now widely accepted as the very essence of cultural difference, account for the considerable conceptual traffic between Euro-American and post-colonial formations of the far right? What are we to make of the specifically European history of anti-Western, anti-imperialist discourse, a pervasive element in nationalist socialist ideology, or the strange cultural mistranslations that link the Indo-Aryan imagination of Nazi Germany with late 20th century Hindu nationalism? It is remarkable, in fact, how closely the paranoid taxonomies of Hindu nationalism or Salafi Islamism reproduce the discourse of European fascism in the mid-20th century, or for that matter, the American religious right of today, both of which obsessively rehearse the cultural failures of, quote, Western secular liberalism, end quote. The civilizational taxonomies of post-secular theory not only misrepresent the historical complexity of relations between religion and the state, they also seriously misunderstand the transnational organization of political religion today. At the beginning of the 21st century, rightist movements such as Hindutva and Islamic Salafism are at once as, quote, authentically, end quote, British and as effectively transnational as the English Defence League. Footnote, see Phil Dickens' article, Fascism, Fundamentalism, and the Left, in Shift magazine, published 2011, and Paul Stott, British Islamism Towards an Anarchist Response, published in Shift magazine, for anti-fascist responses to clashes between the English Defence League and the Islamist right in England. That sounds super interesting, actually. I'm going to save that. So that piece is on libcom. Where am I? End footnote. And at once is, quote, authentically, end quote, French and effectively transnational as élan de Benoît's nouvelle droite, or new right. One cannot hope to understand such movements if one has already subscribed to their mytho-historiography of civilizational difference. Footnote. See Tamir Bar-On, Where Have All the Fascists Gone? For a discussion of Alain de Benoît's Nouvelle Droite and its influence on international white supremacist fascist movements. Notoriously championed by the nominally leftist journal Telos, de Benoît offers an instructive lesson in the dangers of cultural nativism. De Benoît draws on the Gramscian tradition of popular sovereignty to argue in favor of essential cultural differences. End footnote. Paste the narrative of cultural exceptionalism. A comparative historical view reveals a remarkable synchronicity to the worldwide resurgence of religion, even across the most intransigent geopolitical and doctrinal divides. In contexts as diverse and inimical as the United States, Egypt, and Iran, the return of political religion during the 1970s can be correlated with dramatic shifts in the gender, class, and ethnic composition of work, as the Fordist developmental consensus around masculine, formal industrial labor succumbed to the flexible restructurings of post-Fordism. Footnote. See on this point Valentine M. Moghadam, Women, Work, and Economic Reform in the Middle East and North Africa, published in 1998, and on the experience of labor informalization in Iran, see Hamideh Sedghi, Women in Politics in Iran, Veiling, Unveiling, and Reveiling, published in 2007. Sedghi's important study reveals just how critical the expansion of feminized service labor was to the rise of the Iranian religious right during the 1970s. End footnote. The transnational dynamic of these developments defies the phantasmatic geopolitics of West and non-West. Instead, the generalization of contingent, highly gendered and racialized service labor in the post-industrial economies of the United States, Canada, and Western Europe is closely imbricated with the informalization and feminization of both industrial and service labor in the post-colonial world. Whether or not these developments have been associated with the rise of feminism and other movements of sexual dissidence, they have in all cases wrought dramatic changes at the interface of the household and the labor market, changes that the religious far right has uniformly interpreted as a threat to some imagined moral order. The worldwide resurgence of political religion must be understood as a disciplinary response to these changes. Nowhere is this more apparent than in the United States, where the resurgence of political religion has responded very precisely to the massive disruption of household politics that occurred in the late 1960s, under the triple pressure of the feminist, gay, and black liberation movements. Here it needs to be recalled that the transition to post-Fordism was prompted not only by the crisis of U.S. hegemony abroad, but also by the breakdown of the American household as it came to be configured in the wake of World War II. What we call Fordism was never only about the consensus between white industrial labor unions and capital. It pivoted also on a particular configuration of familial politics, one that in the United States incorporated the gendered and racialized divisions of reproductive labor implicit in the family wage. Footnote. For a more detailed discussion of these dynamics, see Angela Mitropoulos, Oikopolitics and Storms, published in Global South 3, number 1, spring 2009. End footnote. When white women exited the Fordist household en masse during the late 1960s, post-Fordism put the, quote, private, end quote, to work, newly restructuring the labor market around intimate and emotional, quote, services, end quote, that were once performed as unpaid work in the private space of the home. During the same period, unprecedented numbers of African American women left their positions as paid household labor in white homes, progressively reduced the gap between their own and white women's wages as they moved into the better-paid white-collar jobs. Post-Fordism internalized the decomposition of the Fordist family wage by placing feminized service labor at the very heart of its accumulation strategy and marginalizing the power of unionized male workers in mass production. But if North American capital proved flexible to the crisis of the Fordist household, it also sought to redraw the terms of obligation, both sexual and economic, on a new and no less punitive basis. Here the religious right has played a decisive role. Beginning in the 1970s, a conservative consensus formed by the religious and fiscal New Right singled out the last remaining remnants of welfare as the locus of family breakdown, especially among the urban poor. In not so subtle ways, these attacks focused on the figure of the African American woman, who was accused at once of being too dependent on welfare and too socially mobile, threatening to undermine both the racial division of labor and the sexual economic foundation of the American household. The African American, quote, welfare queen, end quote, came to stand in for the dislocation of family values in general, and by extension the national crisis of the 1970s. On both sides of the political spectrum, it was agreed that the restoration of American values would need to begin, but not end, with the fostering of proper sexual and economic relations among the African American poor. As Angela Mitropoulos has argued, the politics of the household are as foundational to the emerging neoliberal workfare consensus as they were to the Keynesian welfare state. According to PlutoBooks.com, Angela Mitropoulos is a theorist and academic based in Sydney, Australia. Among other writings which trace back shifting boundaries and movements in the history of philosophy, science, aesthetics, politics, and economics, she is the author of Contract and Contagion, From Biopolitics to Oikonomia. Footnote, back to the text, footnote. Angela Mitropoulos, Contract and Contagion, From Biopolitics to Oikonomia, published with Autonomedia in 2012. End footnote. Neoliberalism may have signaled the demise of the family wage and the Keynesian, quote, sexual contract, end quote, with its sharp divisions of labor between the formal productive sphere and the reproductive sphere of unpaid domestic work, but in its place it has established its own vision of the familial, with its own equally assertive divisions of sexual and reproductive obligation. Faith-based welfare and the comprehensive reforms that introduced it must be understood as the long premeditated outcome of these efforts. What is remarkable about about the recent history of U.S. welfare reform is how closely it aligns the imperatives of economic obligation, on the one hand, and moral/religious redemption on the other. Clinton's Welfare Reform Act of 1996, otherwise known as the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act, not only expanded the scope of welfare-to-work programs, but also oversaw an extraordinary series of legislative interventions around sexuality. Federal legislation now required states to increase their efforts to police, track down, and enforce paternity obligations, stipulated that the biological father of a child on welfare must be forced to pay child support, to be deducted from state welfare payments, whether or not the mother wished to maintain a relationship with him, and what must be understood as a blurring of the boundaries between the free and unfree sexual contract. Subsequent legislation sought to compel biological fathers to fulfill the role of breadwinners by marrying the mothers of their biological children. While the most punitive of these provisions were reserved for unwed mothers, the Welfare Reform Act also included measures to promote married heterosexual procreation among the general public. Religious organizations have been assigned a key role in the practical implementation of such reforms. By means of its, quote, charitable choice, end quote, provision, Clinton's welfare reform transferred extraordinary authority to faith-based organizations, for the first time granting such organizations the right to compete for federal and state welfare contracts without sacrificing the religious character of their services. This provision, followed by George W. Bush's faith-based initiative, has led to a massive expansion of the number of faith-based organizations engaged in the provision of social services ranging from prison programs, welfare-to-work training, disaster relief, sex, (abstinence), and education, marriage and pregnancy counseling, food kitchens, and drug rehabilitation. In the wake of welfare reform, the sexual and economic obligations of work and family have been refashioned in the religious idiom of faith, conversion, and redemption. Footnote. To gain a full sense of the simultaneously moral and economic dimensions of recent U.S. welfare reform, a number of studies should be read in parallel. These include Jamie Peck's Workfare States, published in 2001, Anna Marie Smith, Welfare Reform and Sexual Regulation, published in 2007, Lou Daly, God and the Welfare State, published in 2006, Tanya Ertzen, this article, Testimonial Politics, the Christian Right's Faith-Based Approach to Marriage and Imprisonment, and Jason Hackworth, Faith-Based, The Politics of Religious Neoliberalism in the United States, published in 2012. End footnote. Capital, then, is far from antithetical to the assertion of fundamental value. As Marx will recognize in his later work, the capitalist mode of production is both self-revolutionizing and restorative, sacrilegious and sacralizing. Even while capital strives to overcome all transcendental limits to capital's expansion, it is just as relentlessly compelled to reassert such limits as the internal conditions of capital's continuing valorization. Capital, that is to say, oscillates between the poles of euphoric speculation and austere refoundation, and is maintained in tension between the two in a dynamic that is neither dialectical nor progressive. Marx's thesis on the, quote, double movement, end quote, of capital, outlined in the Grundrisse in the third volume of Capital, challenges all transcendental theories of value, including, it could be argued, his own labor theory of value, by interpreting the, quote, law of value, end quote, as an imperative that is immanent to capital itself. Footnote. For Marx's analysis of the double movement of capital, see Grundrisse, Foundations of the Critique of Political Economy, translated by Martin Nicholas, and also Karl Marx, Capital, Volume 3, translated by David Fehrenbach. And footnote. Capital incessantly undermines and reinstates foundation, both displaces and reimposes the limits to its own reproduction, in a dynamic that is fractal rather than dialectic. As such, the return to fundamental value does not mark the final solution to capitalist contradictions, as the conservative critique of market exchange always imagines, but rather the very form in which speculative value demands to be realized. Far from antithetical to fundamental value, capitalism demands its constant reinvention. Yet while Marx recognized that the restoration of fundamental value can be accomplished through any number of institutional and juridical means, from the generalization of the wage contract to citizenship laws and the creation of national debt, his analysis does not extend to the intimate reproductive dimensions of fundamental value. Capital, Marx famously asserts, quote, drives beyond national borders and prejudices as much as beyond nature worship, as well as all traditional, confined, complacent, encrusted satisfactions of present needs and reproductions of old ways of life, end quote. Marx. Grundrisse. But is it not also compelled to reinvent the, quote, socially necessary, end quote, form of reproduction? Does it not also need to reassert the reproductive foundations of the race, family, and nation as the condition of its own valorization? Inasmuch as the, quote, law of value, end quote, strives to maintain the stable reproducibility of the means of exchange, its purview is sexual as well as economic. On this point, Marx's thinking on fundamental value must be radicalized. The assertion of foundation is never merely, quote, economic in character, since it must ultimately incorporate the, quote, social and cultural, end quote, conditions under which value is to be reproduced, kinship, lineage, and inheritance. Today, the always incipient theology of the, quote, law of value, end quote, has been replaced by the explicit social theology of faith-based welfare. No doubt the move to reinstate foundation is inherently sacralizing in the most abstract sense of the term. Hence the pertinence of political theology even for the most irreligious of 20th century counter-revolutionaries. We are dealing with something a little different, however, when the reassertion of fundamental value assumes the actual doctrinal and institutional form of religion. Herein lies the implacable possibility of political theology in the contemporary context. If biological race defined the shape of mid-20th century nationalism, it is the practice of cultural reproduction and its transcendental signifier, religion, that tends to overdetermine the concept of peoplehood at the beginning of the 21st. This is reason enough not to celebrate its return. The end. Thank you so much for listening.